Looks like there's an echo. Can we, let's call to order the December 16th, 2025 Johnson County Planning Commission meeting. Can we do a roll call, please?
Gregory Wolf,
Here.
Gregory Wolf,
Here.
David Paderas,
Here.
Brad Miller is absent, Lindsay Grisay,
Here.
Fred Starrett is absent, Stephen McGank,
Here.
Tim Orrick,
Here.
Leslie Hind,
Present.
Craig Connell,
Here.
Andrew Logan,
Present by Zoom.
Kevin Hogan,
Here.
and Rod Richardson is absent. And I'll note that Fred Starrett has arrived.
Yes. So it looks like we have a quorum for tonight. I think we'll start off with if there's any public members of the public here or on Zoom, if they want to make a comment.
No members online.
Okay, then we will go ahead. Are there any disclosures of my fellow commissioners of any conflicts of interest or ex parte communications that they would like to have or like to disclose to the Planning Commission? Hearing none, I think we'll move on to the agenda. Does anybody have any proposed additions or deletions to the agenda? All right. The next on the agenda is an approval of the meeting minutes of the October 28th, 2025 meeting. Does anybody have any additions or modifications to propose? And if not, can I get a motion to approve?
Madam Chair, I move to approve the minutes.
Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All
Aye.
opposed? All right, so then we approve the meeting minutes. I think next we'll move on to the regulating short-term rentals. Jay or Sean, do you want to kind of discuss what that is?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Sean Penley, County Planning Staff. Good evening, Commissioners. Yeah, we have a few updates to provide this evening related to the draft zoning regulations update. There's two different topics we'll talk about, and then also there's at the end we'll talk about a proposed consolidation of the East and West zoning boards. But we'll start off with this short-term rental regulations. So we have the presentation here on the screen. We'll go through this. Currently, there are no regulations regarding short-term rentals. These are, the short-term stay allowed in existing residential properties generally, Airbnb, VRBO. Maybe you're very familiar with this. The unincorporated area, we don't currently regulate that in our zoning regulations. Many jurisdictions have begun regulations for these uses. Certainly, it's something that there's not a real proliferation necessarily at this time in the unincorporated area, but we estimate based on some initial research on looking up Airbnb and VRBO websites, there's approximately 13 short-term rentals in the unincorporated area. And certainly allowing for these is a good thing, potentially a benefit to individual property owners for economic benefits and maybe providing additional tourism choices for the public. However, of course, with this type of use, there could be potential negative impacts to neighbors. We have had one property that we're aware of in the past where there has been issues with the neighborhood for a particular property owner who was renting out his property on Airbnb, was having large parties and events occasionally for some of the people who were staying there, and that was causing some disruption for the neighborhood. So that's an example of some of the things that could potentially happen if there's no regulation. So we felt that it was necessary for us to begin that process of providing some standards and regulations for these uses. So we have put together just some basic standards, and this is also as a part of, we were intending on addressing this with the zoning regulations update anyway. And so we did have our consultant, Clarion Associates, help us with some standards, but these are also very typical types of standards that would be in most jurisdictions in this area. So some of the examples, first of all, we would require a registration and a permit for any property owner who is renting out their property for a short-term rental. whatever the medium they're using, Airbnb, VRBO or other, they would be required to get a registration and get a permit, and that could potentially be renewed annually. Some of the general standards would be there should be limits on the occupancy. Generally, it's 2 people per bedroom. A lot of it also just depends on the occupancy or the building code requirements, but we would generally assume that there should be a maximum of 2 people per bedroom plus 2 additional guests as a general standard. So depending on the size of the home, that might be limited to the number of guests that could stay there. No single bedrooms should be able to be rented separately from the rest of the dwelling. This is really intended, I think, to keep from turning it into more like a true bed and breakfast, where it could be more of a commercial operation where you're renting out multiple rooms, and it gets beyond the point of just a short-term rental. It becomes more of a small bed and breakfast. That's a separate provision. Our regulations do address bed and breakfast, and those require a conditional use permit. So what we're talking about is different. It's just renting the entire structure, the house, for guest stay. We do recommend that there should be a designated local responsible party that would be available 24/7 in case there are any issues. Sometimes there may be issues that come up depending on who's staying there. An incident may occur. There needs to be some kind of a local party representative that can attend to any issues, whether that be some type of a designated agent or the actual property owner themselves. We do recommend that they have a local party, and we have provisions on that as far as timing and where they should be, in terms of a local presence in the area to respond to any issues. Parties and events shall be prohibited. This is one of the main standards we want to get to, because obviously these are for if guests are staying in the home, no problem, that's the intent, but this is not intended to be a place where you can rent out a home for a wedding or a special group party. That's where you get into the problems potentially with neighbors and adjacent property. So those would be prohibited, and that's very standard for most short-term rental regulations. There should be quiet hours, generally from 10 p.m. to 10 or 8 a.m. Generally no outdoor activity or noise related to that, and generally no parking on lawns. Those are just some standard regulations that we would recommend as part of our draft regulations. We did, as I mentioned, we did begin some initial research on this, on short-term rental regulations, and many other jurisdictions in the area have either recently adopted or are in the process of adopting regulations for short-term rentals. And our draft standards that we looked at and that we've mentioned are generally consistent with most other jurisdictions. There are some additional details as far as sometimes some inspections may be required and other things, but generally what we are proposing is consistent with most other jurisdictions that have adopted regulations. And this is becoming even more of a potential critical need or timely need for update, because with the World Cup coming in 2026, we do anticipate a large turnout, of course, the public and guests coming in for potentially all over the world for the World Cup matches in June and July of next year. So the emphasis was to get something in place. So if there is an influx or even more of a demand for these, we have regulations in place, and we'd like to get these adopted early 2026 if possible. So our recommendations would be to include definitions and standards for short-term rental regulations in the zoning regulations. We did have an initial presentation and discussion with the Board of County Commissioners at the Committee of the Whole meeting on November 20th of this year. The board was generally supportive of these regulations, and they thought it would be appropriate to have staff begin drafting the regulations and having it ready for adoption in early 2026 in advance of the World Cup, so that these regulations are in effect and valid. Our other regulations, why we want to consider this separate from the rest of the regulations, those are pretty extensive. We're talking about an entire update to our zoning regulations, and we would anticipate, the reality is we still haven't had our public hearings yet and further discussion on draft regulations for modules 2 and 3. We have more updates to come. With all of that, given that the extent of it, we wouldn't have this ready for adoption until probably best be mid-2026. That's right about the time of the World Cup. We want to address this first now and do a kind of an immediate approach to this. So we would propose starting this early next year. So we would need to have a public hearing with the Planning Commission. So we'll prepare, and we already have some draft standards, but we'll provide the details and some additional text that would be included in the current regulations. We would propose scheduling a public hearing in January of next year. And so at our next meeting, presenting the draft standards and holding a public hearing. So we would have to publish for this here in the next week, get that ready for the next meeting, which is on January 27th. So our anticipated timeline, this is the initial discussion with the Planning Commission tonight. We would propose scheduling a public hearing on the next meeting for January 27th with the Planning Commission, and we'll be presenting those draft regulations as part of your packet and publishing a notice for the hearing. And then it would be expected that if the Planning Commission does provide a recommendation on those regulations, we would then present it to the Board of County Commissioners at the meeting on February 26th for final consideration and adoption. So that's it, just kind of a quick review for what we're looking at doing. We wanted to present this to the Planning Commission tonight to get your thoughts, any questions or comments on this, and we'll be happy to answer those.
Craig Connell, I think 3 questions. The first one is on the short-term rentals. The single bedroom restriction. So obviously during World Cup, I think lodging is going to be a premium around town. And could we not have an exemption or even maybe just a rule that if the owner is living in the house, they can rent out a bedroom or two to guests as long as they were in the house when it happened?
Thank you, Craig, Sean Penley, planning staff. That's a good question. And I think this question actually also did come up with the board at the committee of the whole meeting. I think there was a question about considering expanding our regulations to address that. That's a good point. I think certainly if there were some kind of a standard in place that kind of limited that or, would restrict it to maybe no more than 2 rooms or something like that, in addition to, the whole house individually renting out a particular room, that's possible. Another question was, if I recall, the Board of County Commissioners asked about accessory buildings. That's a question I know that we would probably not, the staff would not be opposed to that also. If there's somebody had an accessory dwelling on their property, maybe renting that out, that could be done as well. That's a good point. Maybe we'll address that in the draft presentation in January and consider options for allowing a single room rental and get the response and the consensus from the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, in my particular case, my wife and I live in a 4-bedroom house and the kids are of course long gone. So we use 1 bedroom and we have a walkout with 2 bedrooms downstairs. So they have their own door in and out. It'd be a nice thing. Now, I'm not going to do it, but I'm just saying if somebody had a house like that, what's wrong with, as long as it stayed there, during the time. So.
Jay Leipzig, one thing I was going to mention, the short-term rentals, what really differentiates these is the owner is not, or does not reside at the property or doesn't live in the property. So what you're talking about is really something different, but yeah, we could make those kind of exceptions. It would be just someone renting out, the room in their apartment. And that's where we wanted to have these standards and these best practices when the owner's not present or not available. But what you're talking about is something that question did come up with the Board of County Commissioners as well.
Okay.
We can address that.
All right. My second question is regarding the process to get a certificate or whatever we want to call it. Is that going to require an inspection or is there going to be, if you get flooded with 20 of these in a week, are you going to be able to process them in a week right before World Cup?
Yeah, thank you, Sean Penley. That's a great question as well. We considered that. Ultimately, staff did not recommend a inspection of these individual rental units because, number one, you have to have consent from a property owner, first of all, to do inspection. Second, and that could be done. We have had some situations where when we need to, for like an enforcement issue, staff can inspect the property with consent from the property owner. We could write that into the regulations, but we ultimately decided it would not be necessary. What we would do rather than doing an inspection, we would put out some requirements for what would, again, these standards. So whatever the regulations are with the registration, when an applicant registers for a short-term rental, they will be provided with that license when they register, they'll be given the list of requirements or conditions that apply based on the regulations. And that would be their checklist. Here's what you have to provide. You have to have no parties allowed, local representation, or, having somebody available for contact. So we'd have all that laid out. We did not think it was necessary to have a inspection. We did worry about the same thing, about staffing, availability to do that. When would you inspect it? How could you inspect it without consent from the property? There's some difficulty there. So we would not recommend inspections this initial license.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, one follow-up, Jay Leipzig, they would be, if there are complaints though, then we would have a follow-up inspection to look for any potential violations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
And I think also with that, again, it's easy. What some other jurisdictions do, they do exterior inspections. Staff can do an exterior inspection and see if there's some major deficiency. If there's cars parked on the lawn, or if there's having parties, that's easy to inspect and regulate. What is more difficult is to do inspections of the interior. We cannot enter into the home without consent from the property. So yes, as Mr. Leipzig indicated, that's absolutely, some staff would respond to complaints, and that's part of the reason why we have the local contact. But also, staff could do an inspection upon complaints.
Okay. And my last question is just, assuming it gets approved in February or, March at the latest, what's the communication method to get it out to all the people that are thinking about renting out rooms for World
That's
Cup?
a good question as well. What we would propose, obviously we have a public hearing coming up in January. When we did our initial research, just looking at people currently who are renting out and have a short-term rental, the address is not available publicly. Usually, if you're reserving on VRBO or Airbnb, you get a general contact. You get check in with their app on the whichever media they're using, but you don't get the address. So we don't have addresses of any property owners who are renting out. However, what we would propose is doing a press release, doing social media updates, and posting on our website. Beyond that, I think we're kind of researching options. How could we get that word out? I think it's something that we certainly could do through a couple of different methods, but I think the best way is just to do the press release and just making it known that when this is adopted, here are the requirements. We'd post it on our website, and we, of course, would have the presentation, the public hearing, and then adoption at the Board of County Commissioners. So there'd be a few different ways of getting the word out, but you might not catch everyone. So again, if we get complaints, we hear about somebody renting out, we would then contact that owner if we have the contact information. And then that's really the best way we could get the word out.
Commissioner McGank, I'd like to just make a statement about this. From what you said, we got 13 properties that are doing this right now through Airbnb or VRBO, and you've had one incident. This almost seems like a little bit like governmental overreach to me, that we would step in. And is it really something that we feel is needed when we have just a few incidents, and there's probably laws on the books already that would stop those incidents? And I just have a problem with telling people what they can and can't do on the property. It's one thing if you're a city or an HOA and they ultimately you're living in close quarters. But people who live out in the county for a reason. Usually they like the separation, they like their freedom, they like to do what they want to do. And I don't know. I just got a little bit of a problem with this seeming like a little bit of government overreach to me, when there seems to be a minimal amount of problem at this point. And I can't foresee there ever being a huge problem in this. That's just my thoughts.
Sure. Sean Penley, planning staff. We also heard that similar question did come up from one of the commissioners at the committee of the whole meeting. The question is there really a problem? I don't know if there's a problem currently in the unincorporated area for this. Like I mentioned, there's not really a proliferation of this. However, there could be. There could be an influx. It could be more of these. I think they're becoming more common. When we had that one particular incident with the one property, it was in the Stillwell area, we received a lot of complaints. And it was really a big problem for that neighborhood, I'll tell you. And they ultimately, we had to work with our legal department on enforcement. And they just said outright, look, if you don't have regulations that address this, we can't enforce it. So the decision was, staff felt it was necessary to have, if for nothing else, to have regulations and standards that apply so that anyone who is renting out their home for short-term rentals, that there are regulations that would prohibit parties and events, because that can become a problem. That's why we recommended these standards. We understand that certainly we won't want to take away from anyone's rights. This, of course, would not apply to anyone unless you're actually renting out your home and it becomes you're listing it for rental. It's just to have those standards in place. And that would help with enforcement when there is a problem. That's why we would recommend it.
Well, I agree with Steve on this. And I was wondering, what is the penalty for a violation of this? A violation of this proposal?
The way staff would address any corrective action would be to notify the property owner and require them to get the registration. The penalty, the requirement then to become in compliance would be to get the registration. Penalties, I don't know, that would be assessed by the courts if it became a problem, and if a property owner continued to rent out a property and did not get a registration or a license for short-term rental. Ultimately, we would probably issue a ticket and have them appear in codes court, and then the judge would decide what is the penalty or fine. Generally, the easier compliance is just get the permit, get your registration to allow for you to rent out your home.
I'm a single guy that lives in a 4-bedroom home, and I've actually thought about doing a VRBO or something like that, especially with this big soccer thing coming into town and people wanting places to stay. I haven't thought about it real seriously yet, but the thoughts crossed my mind. And so knowing about this is very beneficial. But I guess we would have to make some kind of an application for that.
That's correct. Yeah, staff is, we're talking about that right now. To get registration, what we would do is we would create the application form, and then you would get, upon review, staff would review the application. This could be an administrative review, so you don't have to go to the board, get a board approval. It could be something that staff would review and approve. We would, if they provide all their contact information, pay their registration fee, they would get the license to allow them to do this. And what we were considering is maybe requiring annual renewal just to make sure and then make a lower fee for a renewal just to make sure that they're doing this annually, complying with any updates. So it would be a form that they would get, an application form, and then they would receive with their license a list of the requirements. Here are the restrictions: no parties, no events, no parking on lawn.
Love it.
Yeah, all the standards. Yeah.
Commissioner Starrett, I think you just answered my question. I just want to be sure. This is a license or permit, if you will, for a period of time, then not per use or anything.
Right. We would imagine this would be an annual permit that you would get for when you're renting out your home. You just get your permit and you certify that you are in fact licensed to rent out your home.
Where's the I guess I don't understand where the license. I thought this was the license process. It's not.
We would have to draft the regulations. Then these regulations would reside in our zoning regulations. Then staff would create the registration form, the application form, and then the property, when they were applying for this, they would get a checklist of those requirements. So yeah, that's just something that the property owner would apply for, and they would receive that registration or that license.
But there's not a license and a permit. It's one thing.
I think
Okay.
we call it a permit, short-term rental permit, maybe.
Okay.
License, yeah.
Thank you.
Quick question, Commissioner McGank. I think I read somewhere, was there a mountain mine that they were going to ask for? Was it $50 or did I dream that up?
What was that for?
For the permit fee?
The amount has not yet been determined. That'd be something that we would have to take, I believe, before we could issue or adopt this requirement. We'd have to take that to the board. The Board of County Commissioners approves all fees that are related to an application or registration. We haven't determined what the fee will be yet. Most of the jurisdictions, from what we've seen, range anywhere from $200 to $300 for a permit, and then renewals might be like $100 or something per year. That's something that we would have to research. We don't know the amount yet of what would be required. That's something that would ultimately be approved as part of the fees, the application fees.
Commissioner Praderis, one question real quick. Does this permit or license, whatever you want, choose to call it, does it afford the property owner any support from the county? You know, i.e., what are they getting out of it? Are they, other than being a compliant household, what's in it for them, I guess is the question. Is there any kind of support that the county is offering them in becoming compliant? You know, are they going to help them out with issues, you know, potentially with unruly tenants or whatever? I have no idea, but you know, is there something that would be overwhelmingly convincing that would cause them to want to comply?
Well, so these short-term rental regulations would be just for only the short-term rental. So this wouldn't be actually like a long-term rental situation. That might be something that just is allowed. You know, that's not something we're looking at. What we're looking at is kind of this repeat use for transient guests. The county would not propose any support for this. It's a regulation. As with most other jurisdictions, what the intent of this is to just ensure that there is no events or activities that are happening at a place where it's normally otherwise would be. You know, if you have a property owner, you're in full control of your property, you're maintaining it, you're not going to generally be a bad neighbor. When you have guests who are paying guests, you don't know what they're going to do. So really all this is, it's a regulatory approach to make sure that there are standards in place. The county would not have in any way be affiliated with the rental or the support of renters. It would just be to establish a requirement for regulations and standards.
Commissioner Grisey, it sounds like the actual support would happen from the neighbors who maybe had issues with the place. Then they could file a code enforcement or something.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not the benefit isn't to the homeowners, it's more to the neighbors, right?
County's response, absolutely. So it's a regulatory issue. The county would enforce any violations, yes. So if a guest were, not complying, we would contact that owner to, enforce the violations to bring in compliance. There would be nothing else that would be of benefit to. It's again just to establish standards and regulations to make sure that there's not activities that wouldn't normally be allowed in a single-family home.
Commissioner Richardson, just a quick question. Would you anticipate that these regulations would prohibit activity by a short-term occupant that would not be prohibited by the owner?
Could you give an example?
Well, for example, I don't know what's in these regulations in terms of if you said, well, if it's a short-term rental, somebody comes in here for the World Cup and they rent a house and there is there's some activity there that would be prohibited under these terms and conditions of these regulations that would not be prohibited if the family that normally lived there undertook them. I'm just trying to understand if the tenants, if the people that occupy under a short-term agreement are under any different, or you anticipate that they would be under any different regulations for behavior than would be the normal occupants of the home.
I think our standards of what we would set as the rules would be just like this example here on this slide. We would just make sure that there's no parties or events, that they have quiet hours, no parking laws. I think there was a question about trash. That's something that has to be handled as you would with your normal trash service. You can't just throw out trash out in the driveway, anytime. You have to follow your normal standards that you would do otherwise. So those are the kinds of requirements. We wouldn't get into any other activities that are not otherwise restricted, if that makes sense. Well, all we're trying to restrict is if there are guests staying that is not the property owner, here's the rules that apply. You have to follow these general rules. They're very, very basic. Like I mentioned, we wouldn't be getting into any other levels of inspection or anything else other than just making sure that the guests are following these rules, and it's the property owner's responsibility to make sure your guests are following these rules.
Okay. Because my only
curiosity about that would be if in fact you were prohibiting under these regulations some behavior that was not otherwise prohibited by the people that actually own the place. I think that could raise some interesting legal questions, but that you've answered my question. So.
Well, I think a good example of that would be the lawn parking. I mean, I can park in my lawn if I want to right now. I mean, there's certainly nothing against it. I live in unincorporated county.
Well, it does vary. If you were in the RUR zoning, you are correct. You could park on your lawn. So again, this may be something we want to talk about, is maybe this applies only to residential zoning districts and not RUR. I don't know. That's a good question.
Commissioner, that is a good point. There's pretty typical when you look at the regulations for short-term rentals. There are usually some restriction on parking in lawns. So maybe in a rural area, you know, I don't think it applies across the board. So we probably have to look at that in terms of depending which zoning district the particular property is located in, to kind of look at revising that a little bit. That's a very good point, though.
All right, Commissioner Grisey, is there any other questions or comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So staff will, if sounds appropriate, what we'll do, since we also did get the general indication from the Board of County Commissioners, they like preparing these draft standards. What we'll do is we'll prepare text for the draft regulations. We'll bring that back to the board at the January meeting. We'll schedule a public hearing, and then we'll review that the draft regulations, and get any comments and input from the commission at that time, and request a recommendation to the board. Thank you.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, everybody, for the good questions. Let's move on to the zoning regulations updates.
All right. Thank you again, Sean Penley, County Planning staff. So as mentioned before, we've been working on the draft regulations for the zoning regulations. And we have recently completed Module 1, which is the zoning districts and uses and use restrictions. And we had a meeting with our advisory committee. I believe it was in October. At that time, we were still finalizing draft Module 1. And we also had 3 public hearings in October to present some of the draft regulations. And then we also, again, had an update to our Board of County Commissioners in November at the Committee of the Whole meeting, again, to give them an update on this. We'll go through kind of just a really quick overview again for the purpose and you know, the goals of this, of course, is to modernize our regulations. And as we've mentioned before, there's a lot of things that we need to do to update some of these standards. They're outdated currently. The last comprehensive update to the regulations was 1994. So there's several zoning districts that are outdated and not currently being used. We need to modernize that. We also need to incorporate new standards that are predictable and flexible so that property owners and applicants know what the requirements are, and the expectations are following best practices. And we want to reduce some of the conflicts and inconsistencies we have currently in the regulations. And again, this is to implement best practices for zoning, both for this area in Kansas and around the nation, just looking at best practices for planning and zoning, and of course, to ensure that they're legally sound and defensible. That's something that we need to coordinate with, of course, being that this will be a legal document. Just again, real quick on the timing of the update. So we started this in mid 2024. We had began the assessment and the draft, started the draft regulations in the spring of this year, and we've completed that Module 1. We have had some initial public outreach already for that Module 1 in October. We will also talk about the next step when we bring forward the future modules 2 and 3, with more detailed development standards and procedures. Those will come in the next standards early next year. And we anticipate hopeful adoption of this by mid 2026. So in this module one, what we're going to be talking about are the base zoning districts, special zoning districts, overlays such as airport overlay district, floodplain overlay district. Talking about allowed uses, we're going to have a new table that will list all the permitted uses by a zoning district, get into some of the use specific standards. And then within each district, there are different area measurements and dimensional standards that apply. That's in this section. So this module one is really kind of the basic nuts and bolts of the regulations that cover all of the different zoning districts and uses that are permitted. And then the area and dimensional standards. So we'll get into that with some examples here. So for our zoning districts, what is changing? We are eliminating the planned districts. So currently every one of our zoning districts, whether it's residential, commercial, or industrial, each has a different planned district version of the base district. So in other words, rather than just having an RUR, we also have a PRUR, a planned rural residential. We are proposing to eliminate that, and rather we'll replace it with base zoning districts and reduce the total numbers of zoning districts. So currently, I believe there's about 18 different zoning districts. We're going to be reducing that down to about 11 or is this 12 maybe? And actually, I think it's more than 18 if you consider all the non-residential districts as well. So we're going to basically limit the number of zoning districts in half, make them more predictable. And then we will also talk about one planned district option that will allow for flexibility if if an application comes forward and it can't meet certain requirements, there is an option for a planned district that'll apply. That's kind of like it's an overlay or one of these special zoning districts. We'll talk about that as well. So just to give an example of what the area and dimensional standards we're talking about and to incorporate some graphics and make this a little bit more user-friendly, this is an example of the layout and development standards for the RR district for this rural residential district. This would be a new zoning district. We want to put in all the dimensional standards. So there's a table that will accompany each zoning district with all the minimum setback and area requirements. Currently, we have all that in text in our current regulations. So we're going to be replacing that with, although we'll have text, we'll also have tables and illustrations to show what is the setback, how do you measure the setback, what's the area requirement. And so we'll have a table and a corresponding graphic for each one of these zoning districts to help illustrate some of those requirements. And this is one example for the rural residential district. For commercial districts, same thing. Generally, we'll have just three different commercial districts, a C1, C2, and a C3. And these will give again, here's kind of like a C1. This would be like your light intensity neighborhood commercial type uses. This again shows an illustration for development, showing the minimum setbacks, area requirements, and the table with all those uses.
Sean, what does FAR stand for?
Floor area ratio.
Okay.
So that's an example of something where there might be a kind of limit. You want to kind of limit the amount of area that building occupies on a site, so you're not maxing it out. You actually still have some open space and not taking up the entire site with a building and parking. So this again is an example for the commercial districts, and each one of the different zoning districts will have one of these. Open space and parks. Currently, we don't have this district. This will be a new district. The purpose of this will be, and we've had initial discussions with Johnson County Park and Rec District. We allow for parks in any district generally, but we require a conditional use permit, which is not always necessary. You shouldn't have to have a conditional use permit or a special permit. It used to be a conditional use permit. Now we have a special permit. It wasn't necessary, we didn't think, to have a special permit every time a park came in, but rather if it could be zoned open space parks, this new district, the park could basically be, once the site is zoned OSP, this open space and parks, the park could be allowed to do whatever they have in their master plan that's allowed in a park. So for example, any JCPRD park that comes in, they zone to this new OSP district, they would be allowed to have any normal programming use that they would have in any of their parks, as long as it was approved as part of their master plan with the zoning district. So this would be a new zoning classification. JCPRD did like the idea of this. They appreciated this and something that they supported. So this is just an example of a new zoning district that would be for parks. Again, as I mentioned, the planned district, we rather than keeping individual plan districts for each category like PRUR, PRN, PRB1, rather than have a plan district for each type of zoning, we would do one plan district that will serve as an overlay. So if a particular development couldn't meet a minimum standard, a minimum area or setback requirement, but if it had a unique provision, like it allowed for more open space or it was protecting additional floodplain on the property, maybe they could get a planned district overlay on top of their standard RUR or whatever it is to allow for exceptions or flexibility of the standards that could be approved as part of their zoning. So they could get a zoning and then a planned district on top of that would allow for more flexibility. This we thought was a good approach to eliminate those planned districts. Use specific standards. So we've put together in the draft for each type of land use, there are specific use standards that will apply. This is where we get to the actual requirements of what's allowed for a particular use. Say for a contractor yard, they would be allowed to have a contractor yard provided they meet the use specific standards. All of these will be spelled out for each different type of use. There will be a certain listing of uses and development standards that will apply. So this is to help address traffic, noise, lighting, parking, some of the potential issues that might cause for disruption with neighboring properties. Also could potentially limit hours of operation and the size of the development and providing buffering and landscaping standards to minimize impacts for some of those uses. Generally, what we're trying to address are non-residential uses. So there will be a table attached to each one of the uses that'll lay out and list all of the requirements and the standards that apply. So the Module 1 draft regulations are now posted on the county's website. So we've recently just posted these on our project page, and we're using an application called Conveo, which will allow for the public to comment on the draft regulations. This is the link here that we've posted on our website. We've sent out a recent press release to announce this and also social media updates. We're now going to send out updates, a group email blast to all of the people who signed in at our public open house meetings. We're going to send out updates to our stakeholders, anyone who's been requesting to keep up to date on this, and then also all of the planning boards. We'll send out an update to the Planning Commission, our zoning boards, the advisory committee, and again, any development stakeholders. We've been keeping them up to date. So this will allow for the public to review these regulations and make comments if they have any comments or suggestions for changes. The comments, you have to register. This one thing we'll put on this update is that you have to register on the Conveo website. But then once you register, you can post your comments and staff will be able to collect all these and we'll bring back any comments to the Planning Commission and our advisory committee for review and consideration if we need to potentially edit or further modify the regulations to address some questions. We can do that. So this is something we're excited about, to have the public being able to comment on this, and we'll get that word out here this week. So next steps, we were, as I mentioned, wrapping up Module 1, but we're making it available for public review. We will be coming forward with Module 2 early next year. This is where we'll get into more of the detailed development standards, such as parking, landscaping, sign regulations, lighting regulations. And these are where I think there's going to be probably even more interest from the public on some of these are the standards that we really do need to update because our standards are currently outdated. So we'll have a draft review ready, we hope, in January for staff to begin review. Then we're hoping to have this available for the public in late January or early February. And then we'll bring back, again, we'll do another update to the advisory committee and planning commission with those draft development standards. And then once we have all of the other, and then that's Module 2, then there'll be a final Module 3, which will include procedures, more of the legally specific requirements for what's required in terms of going through procedural requirements. Once we have all those draft standards ready, we'll schedule a public hearing at the Planning Commission and get the word out, so prepare a legal notice and have that ready for public review sometime in spring of next year. And then the goal will be to hopefully have everything ready for adoption by summer of next year. So that's kind of the quick rundown of the draft regulation for Module 1. I'm happy to answer any questions and provide update.
Commissioner Starrett, I have a question when I was looking through this stuff, and we've recently had discussion about expanding roads from 2-lane to 4-lane. And I can't tell by looking at this if the new requirements for setback take into consideration that in 20 or 30 years, any or all of these roads might be 4-lane instead of 2-lane. Is that something you're considering with these numbers?
So in our zoning regulation, I think you may be referring to like CARNIP, like with our standards for the road designations for arterials. The zoning regulations won't dictate that. That was more of that policy area. That's in the comprehensive plan. That's more of that long-term policy issue. We're talking about 2-lane or 4-lane, the different arterial types. The zoning regulations are really more addressing minimum requirements such as setbacks and area requirements for individual properties. It does get into right of way. So there's if somebody's subdividing the property, they would be subject to certain right of way requirements, providing a minimum of say 60 feet of right of way along an arterial street. But it wouldn't dictate what type of road you have to have in front of your house, except for that is a minimum infrastructure requirement.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Commissioner Starrett again. Some of the people that came to our hearing said that we'd be tearing down houses and stuff. And I assume that they were okay when they built them, but if they go to 4-lane, add a lane on each side of the road, that's going to be a problem for some of those properties. And I'm just wondering if what we're doing interfaces with a heads up that this could happen. So if you got a 10-acre plot, you might not want to be right on the road or, something like that.
Oh, certainly for anyone who is looking to subdivide their property, yeah, this would be really helpful for them to see this and get the requirements for what are the setbacks, what are the minimum infrastructure requirements. Absolutely. Anyone who does approach that, we often meet with individual property owners who are looking to subdivide their property or maybe do a track split. And we absolutely do give them a heads up on both CARNIP, the future road network plan, as well as the types of road designations and our zoning regulations. So absolutely, we are always informing property owners when they're looking to subdivide their property. But yeah, it certainly would be, the public will be absolutely very interested in this for a number of reasons, both whatever their permitted, permissions and what they're allowed to do with dividing the property or developing the property. This would be of great interest to anyone doing that. And we had a really good turnout at the public open house meetings. Each one, there was a pretty good interest from the public. So,
okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Jay Leipzig, one other comment is the zoning regulations would be consistent with the CARNIP recommendations as well. So if for certain aspects of it, if they apply. So what you're doing here is consistent with what the overall CARNIP designations would be as well.
Thank you.
Commissioner Richardson, it's been my experience on serving on zoning boards for quite some time that they give certainty, the old phrase that all zoning is local. And I've always understood that to mean it can be of great concern to the people in the area where the rezoning has occurred because they're concerned about the use. But the practical matter, it's only a concern to those people and simply not a concern to the rest of the community who isn't affected by it. Their representative, let's say on the city council or BOCC, is concerned about it, but the others aren't. And a lot of times we've seen things that had significant local opposition be approved on the theory that what's good for the county as a whole is good for the county as a whole, rather, and it bypasses the local opposition. I think that's just a fact of life, and those types of uses are going to be approved if they're of community significance, etc. But it does raise to me, and I've certainly said this in our zoning board meetings, that when that happens and you've got these types of uses that and I'm going to say sports facilities, heavily lit things that create a lot of noise, things that are disruptive, but maybe otherwise are going to be approved because they're, the commissioners think they should be. That we really need these new zoning regulations to look very hard at the strength of our mitigation requirements. That developers that come in and want to put these in, that build them and then depart, and the commissioners that approve them and then move on to the next item on the agenda, leave the local folks to suffer or enjoy, as the case may be, that particular use. I'm not smart enough to define all the different sorts of mitigation that might be in there, but I know when I have an opportunity to look or comment on these things, which I most certainly will do, I'd certainly be hopeful that you experts and the planning staff are looking hard at, hey, if we're going to approve this, but we've got lighting concerns, we really need to look at the lighting regulations. We really need to look at the noise regulations and the traffic regulations and place the burden on the developers to reasonably mitigate those. They'll never get it perfect, but I don't think there's enough attention on any zoning code I've ever seen really paid to the recognition of the fact that when the local folks are concerned about something, they're usually not lying about it. They are concerned about it. And I think it would be much better to be able to say, well, we're not going to deny the use because we think it's good for the community, but we're going to lock you down hard on mitigating to the greatest extent reasonably possible on mitigating the impact of those uses, whether it's screening, light shielding, whatever, So I know you guys attempt to do that all the time, but I do think that's an area that deserves 2 or 3 looks hard at as whether or not that's really addressed as much as it should be.
Yeah, Commissioner Grisey, I'd like to just piggyback on that. I think some of the frustrations I've personally had and what I've heard from a lot of constituents is that the violations or the regulations are often not easy to measure. And so it's not easy to say, okay, this one's in violation or not. And so I think, so I think that, as a resident and then both also now on the commission, I think that sometimes it's been challenging to say, okay, how do we measure a violation such that a resident who feels that there's a violation happening can call and make that, if everything's so squishy and it's not clear who's the deciding factor. So I guess I would suggest that to the extent that there are ways to have measurable, okay, this is a clean violation, this isn't, and that there's a process in the regulations for residents to make a complaint. And, because for example, if it's a noise regulation or a lighting regulation, so if they say, for example, if there's a sports facility and the lights are not appropriate, but it requires a planning staff member to come and witness the lights not being appropriate, and the planning staff only works 8 to 5, then it's challenging for a resident to, okay, well, the lights aren't on during the day. And so I guess I would just challenge, are there ways that either that enforcement can either be more measurable and that there's easier ways that residents can bring forth a potential violation such that they can make sure that the regulations are being enforced consistent with the spirit of the regulations.
Commissioners, good points, Jay Leipzig. The only thing I would say, and we showed the graphic for the use specific standards. Those are best practices. That's something when you look at our current code doesn't have there's no descriptions like that in terms of what is entailed with those. So that's a partial answer to Commissioner Richardson's question about having detailed standards for those uses, and that will hopefully mitigate many of those concerns. The other piece of it is having a clearly defined process for violations, and part of those standards when they're developed using best practices is so they're objective standards. So they're more so less squishy, I think was the term that was used. So that's part of the point of it. It's just to create those detailed standards to provide enough relevance that we can have to to be able to tell or differentiate if there's a problem with a particular use and if not consistent with our zoning regulations. That's really where the standards are so important, because and it will vary by use, and gives staff enough direction to know when something is prohibited, but at the same time is clearly defined for the applicant, for the developer to understand what we're talking about too. I hope that answers part of the question, but
Yeah.
Thanks, Jay. Madam Chair, just one other thing I'd note. A lot of those specific types of developments that might include more of those potential neighborhood impacts or surrounding property owner impacts will be addressed in Module 2, because that's when we're going to get into the detailed development standards, such as lighting, noise, traffic, some of the things that are often hard to define and measure. We are going to provide development standards that will apply, that have more detailed requirements. So that's in effect. It's a lot of what we have, and they're just things that need to be updated, and that's going to be included in Module 2. So
Thank you.
We'll provide an update for that in that module.
Lovely. Any other questions? Okay, I think we'll move on to a discussion of the zoning board consolidation.
okay. Thank you, Commissioners. Jay Leipzig, the Planning Department. This item was presented, as mentioned earlier this evening, on the Committee of the Whole before the Board of County Commissioners on November 20th. And this idea is something that staff has discussed previously over the years, of looking at the number of applications we receive every year, the declining population, or excuse me, the declining land use area in the county, and looking at when is it appropriate or timely to consolidate the zoning districts. And I apologize, some of the commissioners will have already heard this presentation. Others will be hearing it tomorrow night as well. So you'll get it twice for those on the East Zoning Board or the West Zoning Board. But I'm going to take the lead on this, then Sean can back me up with other details that we need to go through here as well. So just a quick summary of the history of zoning board consolidations. There have been 8 consolidations since 1984 through 2023. So we actually had 8 different zoning boards at one time. And then the most recent consolidation was done in 2023. The Southeast Zoning Board changed its name to the East Consolidated Zoning Board, and the Northwest and the Southwest Zoning Board combined to create the West Consolidated Zoning Board. So that's just a little bit of background going from 2023 as we to this date. And so I wanted to give a quick overview on terms of the statutory membership. And I think there's something like 3 or 4 attorneys on this commission. So this is probably, I'm not an attorney, so it's a quick review by the statutory membership that's stated by the state statute. Planning Commission have 9 members, but not more than 12. 9 from the unincorporated area, 1 member from each zoning board is required, established by ordinary resolution consistent with KSA 19-2957. And then the Consolidated Zoning Board must be 5 persons, but not more than 9 members. Consolidation requires published notice 2 times at least 10 days before the public hearing. And so those are the statutory requirements. And then we'll go into more detail about exactly what the membership within the county. This map has a quick overview of the land area between the East and the West Zoning Board. And it's pretty apparent when you look at this. In other words, total acreage between the West and the East. The West has quite a bit more land area than the East, but the East Zoning Board has a more populated area. So just a quick summary, quick overview of that when you look at the 2 zoning boards in the unincorporated area. And then looking at the land area from 2020 through 2025, we had 121,000 acres, or about 122,000 acres in 2020 that was reduced down in 2025 to 106,887. About 9,000 of those acres, though, was the recent Sunflower Army Ammunition Plant annexation area by the city of DeSoto. So that was a significant chunk of it. I believe that was in 2021 when that happened. So you can look at the difference there between 20 and 2023. So if you look at, we have a decrease in acres of about 15,000. The number of parcels has increased slightly from 2020 through 2025 to 163. And our population from 2020 to 2025 has increased by 8 people. So it's kind of interesting when you look at those statistics that we're working with. So the land area is getting smaller. The parcels we're continuing to add additional parcels. Okay. And then, so the application considered by the zoning boards, we have, and this, for this particular slide, we just looked at 2023 to 2024. 2023 is a partial year, because we didn't complete the consolidation until August of that year. So that's why those numbers are so much lower. But in 2024, we have 17 applications from the East Zoning Board, 24 from the West. And then this year in 2025, we have 15 from the East, 17 from the West Consolidated Zoning Board. And then just a quick meeting summary. We've had in 2023 through 2025, we've had some canceled meetings, 3 in 23, 4 in 2024, and 2 in 2025 for the East Zoning Board. And this shows also the number of meetings for that board. We have the same slide for the West Consolidated Zoning Board. Shows the scheduled meetings and the canceled meetings that were in place. So in 2025, there's been 7 meetings of the West Consolidated Zoning Board. 1 of those has been canceled. And either that is because there wasn't an application presented, or there was not a quorum. We didn't specify what that particular reason was for the cancellation. So the factors for consolidation, why this was brought up and for discussion with the board, is the jurisdiction land area continues to shrink for the unincorporated Johnson County. The number of applications for the East Zoning Board and the West Zoning Board are generally equal following the consolidation that we had in 2023. We do anticipate a reduction in the application of the zoning boards due to the update in the regulations, allowing for a more efficient process with administrative review by staff. That is one of the key points, is when the new zoning regulations are hopefully adopted in next summer, is that will be a much more streamlined, efficient process. And I think we will have less applications coming forward from the zoning boards. And certainly a more streamlined approach to those applications. And then is also an expected decline or shrinking pool of potential board members able to serve on the zoning boards. So just in looking at this and providing a quick recommendation that we propose for the East and West Zoning Board, total of 9 members. Currently, we have 7 members on each zoning board now. So we'd be bumping that up to 9 members. The 3rd, the 6th district, and the chair, and each would appoint 3 members. So 3, 3, and 3. When we presented this before the East Consolidated Zoning Board, they suggested 4, 4, and 1. It's just one of the comments that they had. So keeping the 9 members, but dividing it up that way. But staff, when this is presented to the Board of County Commissioners, looked at an equal division with 3, 3, and 3. The proposed nomination of the Planning Commission, which we wanted to bring this before you this evening as an informational item. We still are recommending the Planning Commission would stay at 12 members. So the membership of the Planning Commission would remain the same. The 1st and the 4th district would each nominate 1 person from the city. The 2nd and 5th district would each nominate 1 person from the unincorporated area. And then the change here, we have 3 from the 6th district and 3 from the 3rd district. We would just have 6 from the unincorporated area of the county from representing the zoning board. And then the chair would have 2 nominations. 1 nominee from the unincorporated area and 1 nominee from the city. So it doesn't change the makeup of the planning commission dramatically. That would still remain the same. Just having two separate zoning boards, we would have one zoning board that would be combined together. And so next steps, as I said, this was presented to the Board of County Commissioners on November 20th. The direction was to present this to the zoning boards of the planning commission for initial discussion, and then go back to the Board of County Commissioners in January with a recommendation, reorganization resolution in January of 2026. So wanted to get this in front of you to get any potential thoughts on this, and open that up for discussion. You know, at one time there was some discussion about combining, having a planning and zoning commission like many cities have, but there's again, the attorneys in the room will be able to tell the exact statute of, there's a restriction in Johnson County. We're not able to do that without a statutory change. But we can consolidate the zoning boards, so we create one zoning board in one planning commission. And with that, I'll just open up for any questions you might have or other comments.
Greg Donald. Jay, two questions. First of all, is the timing of this would be implemented about when the zoning regulations get approved? You talking about this efficiency improvement on zoning requirements. So would the timing be to implement them at the same time, or?
Mr. Jay Lives, Mr. Connell, we'd actually asked the Board of County Commissioners that question. They would prefer to do it in January to allow the board to get seated and settled before the new zoning regulations would be adopted next summer.
Okay.
That was the question, whether to wait to do it or do it fairly soon.
Okay. Second question is on the zoning board. It didn't specify it, but would all the members be from the unincorporated part of the county, all 9?
Yes.
Okay.
Commissioner Richardson, at the when you presented this to our board, the East Consolidated Zoning Board, several of the members of the board expressed an interest in knowing about the balance on the Consolidated Zoning Board, and I know you were going to kind of look into that, but I think there was some concern that with it's possible, depending on who appoints who from where, that you could have a majority on that board that is not representative of, let's say, the East or the West, as opposed to having, equal members, so that you have, equal on both sides in terms of representation. In reality, I don't know that that's particularly a concern, but it was raised by the East Zoning Board as to kind of equity from both sides, or preserving that so one side isn't out of balance with the other. I'm just curious if you've given any thought to that, or if that's come up as an issue anywhere else that you presented this.
Commissioner Richardson, that issue, this is the second presentation I've given, so it hasn't come up aside from the East Zoning Board. However, staff is certainly, your concerns are noted and noted before the East Zoning Board as well. So, and that will be part of our comments back to the Board of County Commissioners too.
Okay. Thank you.
Perfect. I think with that, then we'll move on to the director's report.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of quick updates this evening on the applications reviewed by the Board of County Commissioners in your packet. If you do have any questions about that, please let me know. At our last meeting, we had quite a significant discussion about the comprehensive plan amendments at our last meeting on October 28th. That item will be before the Board of County Commissioners on it'll be before the Board of County Commissioners on January 22nd, 2026. We're going to have a committee of the whole to discuss that item with the board on January 15th, and then we'll be out for action on January 22nd of 2026. The future agenda items, the election of officers and the year in review will be coming up the next meeting. We're still looking at, and I will have an update again for you with the final direction of the Board of County Commissioners about the consolidation issue. And with that, Madam Chair, that's all I have. Other
Uh,
questions?
Fred Connell, I have one question on that. So to understand what you just said, our two motions that we passed in our last meeting have not been presented to the BOCC yet?
That is, Commissioner, that is correct.
Okay.
Do we know, the Commissioner Grisay, do we have a date for the January meeting?
For this, Madam Chair, this body, the next meeting is January 27th.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much to the planning staff for that information. For my fellow commissioners, does anybody have any old business or new business that they'd like to discuss? Okay, with that, could I get a motion for us to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, happy holidays, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great holiday.